George W. Bush Presidential Center, Ken Hirsch.
Thank you so much, and welcome to the Bush Center. It's the only place where the president outranks the CEO. And it's an honor for me to serve in this capacity and welcome you all here tonight to the Engage at the Bush Center series presented by Highland Capital. It's an honor that we get tonight to celebrate the life of the 41st President of the United States. And that's something that's unique to this place, and I'm really excited that you're all here to share in the experience. I want to especially thank Highland Capital, who has underwritten this series and has been a wonderful supporter, and their Chief Investment Officer and co-founder, Mark Okada, is here with us tonight. Thank you, Mark, for all that you do for us. And without further ado, it's my honor to introduce the 43rd President of the United States.
Thank you. Sit down. Thank you all for coming. Remembering 41, I remember him fondly, as do our panelists. First, I want to thank the body men, that's what we call the personal aides, the body men who are here, Frechette, Bates, and McBride. These are three people who traveled the world with Dad, traveled the country with Dad, got to see him like very few people have, and I want to thank you all for taking time. Well, you're not employed, so it doesn't matter. Anyway. And then I'm not saying they're not a highlight, but imagine getting Jimmy Baker to come to the Bush Center. It's such a thrill to have my dad's best friend here. Now, he's going to be interviewed by noted historian and local lawyer Talmage Boston. But Baker, look, he's such a good friend that he was the one that smuggled the Grey Goose vodka into the hospital room when Dad was in the ICU. He was his tennis partner, and there's still doubt as to who carried who. He called my dad Heffy, and he called me Heffy Jr., hence the derivation of my grandfather name, Heffy. Thankfully, the granddaughters dropped the junior. At any rate, I thank you all for supporting us. I thank you for coming to hear stories about a great man. And now I would like to introduce our panel of Talmage Boston and one of the great public servants ever, James A. Baker.
Secretary Baker, as the best friend, we get a chance to go down memory road, and let's start at the very beginning. In the 1960s, you and George H.W. Bush first bonded as a winning team on the Houston tennis circuit as doubles partners.
Well, first we bonded as a losing team. And then we won a couple of times.
And then you won the Houston Country Club Championship in '66 and '67. So how did George Bush's personality manifest itself on the tennis court?
Well, you know, if you had a serve that was as weak as George Bush's serve, you had to have a strong personality. But we both had the weakest serves anybody has ever seen. I don't know how the hell we won any tournament, much less the championship 2 years in a row. But Heffy was an extraordinarily good net player, and he was a competitor like you've never seen. I mean, he would never give up. We'd be down 6-0, 5-0, and he'd say, "We're going to win this thing." And we'd go out, and we played a lot with the club pro, whose name was Hector Salazar. David Bates used to play with us, and Jeb and others. And Hector was a damn good tennis pro, and he was a good player, but he had the ability to play customer tennis. So he'd carry us along, and he would make it close. But Heffy always thought that we were gaining every time. every time Hector would throw a point, he'd say, "You see, we've got him now." We're gonna get him." So, anyway, we lucked out, notwithstanding those weak serves.
Well, George H.W. Bush often said, "Where would we be without friends?" And he once said of you that you're a man to whom friendship means everything. So 3 years after your last tennis championship, you suffered a tragedy when your first wife, Mary Stewart, passed away with cancer, leaving you with 4 young sons. So at that very tragic time, how did your friend George Bush step up and support you?
Well, we were close. He and Barbara were the last people to see Mary Stewart before she, other than her family, the last people other than her family to see her before she lapsed into a coma and died. They came to see her the day before she went into that final coma. They came to the hospital on any number of occasions. He was very, very supportive of me. And it was after her death that he came to me and he said, "You know, Bake," he said, "you got to take your mind off your grief. How about helping me run for the Senate?" I said, "Well, George, that's a great idea, except for 2 things. Number one, I don't know anything about politics. I was a lawyer trying to make it in the competitive atmosphere of a major Houston law firm. I didn't know much about politics. And I said, number one, I don't know anything about politics. Number 2, I'm a Democrat." But you need to understand, all you young people out there need to understand that in those days, everybody in Texas was a Democrat. The dividing line was whether you were a conservative Democrat or a liberal Democrat. I was a conservative Democrat. Ultimately, we were conservative Democrats all became Republicans. But after I said that, George said, "Well," he said, "you know, we can take care of that latter problem." and we did. And I tell people, if I'm talking to a group of Republicans, I say I got religion. And if I'm talking to a bunch of Democrats, I say I changed parties. So we did. And I was just talking to 43 back in there about the beginnings. Subsequently, of course, we began a campaign for president. And we were nothing burgers. I mean, we were an asterisk in the polls. We never even polled 1%. I happened to have been the only living Republican who had run a presidential campaign. I had been chairman of President Ford's campaign against Carter. I was the only living Republican who had run a presidential campaign and not gone to jail. And that's the truth, if you think about John Mitchell and a few of the others. So people would come to me and they'd say, "What in the hell are you doing? Your candidate is an asterisk in the poll. John Connolly's going to be our next president. And why are you doing this?" And I said, "Well, he's my buddy, he's my friend, and I believe in him." And we started from there, and we ended up not winning. We lost to Reagan in the primary, but George was the last person standing, and we had delegates, and that's how he made it on the ticket and became vice president for 8 years, which of course led to his presidency.
Well, during the course of that campaign, I'm curious, was there any real friction between you as the campaign manager and your best friend as the candidate?
I've said before, and I wrote in my book, it's hard to be a campaign manager for a friend. It's easy to lose the friendship because you're the person who has to say, "No, you got to make another trip. No, you got to get on back out there," or "No, we can't do this, but you must do that," and all that. So there were a lot of times when we could have lost the friendship, but we didn't. The toughest time, I think, was in May of 1980. We had run a good race. We were the only candidate in the race other than Reagan who had accumulated some delegates. But mathematically, we'd been ruled out mathematically, even if we won every other primary, we couldn't pick up enough delegates. And so I suggested that maybe it was time for us to get out. And George looked at me and said, "I'm not a quitter." And I said, "Well, you know, if you want to have any shot at being vice president, now's the time, probably the time to fold them." The question was whether we were going to go to California and compete against Reagan in his own home state. The primary with Reagan had been fairly bitter. Some smart ass who was running Bush's campaign came up with the idea that supply side economics was voodoo economics. I don't know who did that, but and Reagan hated it, and Miss Reagan hated it even more. And so, but it was time to go. But I want to tell you, George's position on that was, "I am not a quitter. I'm not running for vice president." I said, "I know you're not running for vice president, but more people become president by first becoming vice president than any other way." That was the only time there was ever any real serious friction between us. And I should add here, I was privileged to serve as his Secretary of State for 4 years, and I was extraordinarily fortunate to serve a wonderful friend and a beautiful human being, as we all know. But to serve as Secretary of State to a president who understood that he had to defend me and protect me even when I was wrong, and he did. And I was wrong on a number of occasions, but he was always there. He always had my back. Whenever I went out and said something, people knew I was speaking for the president.
Now, going back, after Ronald Reagan won the nomination and he selected George Bush as his vice president, and then he beat Jimmy Carter in November, and he chose you as his White House chief of staff, over the next 4 years, we know that many times in the White House there are turf battles. So was there ever a time when you had to stay true to your boss, who was the president, while also having to stay true to your best friend, who was the vice president?
No, and the reason was because my best friend, the vice president, understood the job of vice president. And he understood that his job was to give the president his best advice, but not to do it in a big meeting, because there are no secrets in Washington. Everything is leaked. And he was smart enough to give the president that advice in private. I should add that Reagan didn't want to pick Heffy to be his vice president. In fact, if you study the convention in 1980, you'll know that he went to great lengths to romance Jerry Ford to come back to be vice president. I saw President Ford after that blew up, and I said, you know, and I had been his campaign chairman in '76. I said, you know, Mr. President, if that had happened, it never would have worked. We would never have known what to call you. Were we going to call you Mr. President, Vice President, or Mr. Vice President, President? But fortunately, Reagan himself, with some of his senior aides being opposed, said, "Get me Bush," and they had a wonderful relationship for 8 years, and he was a quintessential vice president for that president. So I know for a fact they both concluded that he'd made the right choice.
No doubt.
Reagan.
No doubt. So after President Reagan's second term ended, George Bush won the '88 election and became our nation's 41st president. And during his presidency, as you've said, you served as the Secretary of State. And during those years, among other things, the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War ended, Germany became unified, and the U.S. led an international coalition to win the Gulf War. Now, among all those major international events, the Bush foreign policy team functioned flawlessly, unlike almost every other president's foreign policy team. So what was it about his leadership skills and his emotional intelligence that allowed him to have this great team that functioned like a well-oiled machine?
Well, first of all, he knew foreign policy. He understood it. He liked it. He had experience in it. He'd been our ambassador to the United Nations, in effect our ambassador to China, director of the CIA, and he understood how the national security apparatus ought to work, and he saw to it that his was going to work that way, and he did that through leadership. First of all, he picked people for the jobs who had worked with each other in other iterations, and primarily in the Ford administration, but in other capacities. And so we didn't have the backbiting and the fighting and backstabbing that has gone on in so many national security teams. He understood foreign policy. He, with respect to me personally, I can tell you, the first time the Washington Post, after this was probably I became Secretary of State in January of '89, and in probably March of '89, the Washington Post ran a long story. Foreign policy is being run out of the White House. The National Security Council has charge of foreign policy. State Department's out of the action, and so forth and so on. I got a call from the president the next day. I want you and Susan to come up to Camp David for the weekend. So we went up there to Camp David, and they had a lot of press coverage of it, and that was the last time any story like that ever surfaced. That's the way he was. He was the same way with the other members of his national security team. And the result was there was a collegial atmosphere that worked. I think it worked for him and worked for the country.
Now, often there could be a problem when there are unauthorized leaks by members of the team, but he had almost none of that. What kind of instructions did he give to the team about the need to maintain confidentiality, or was it something that you all completely understood and no one ever thought about violating?
No, there were a lot of violations of that. You need to, first you need to define what a leak is. A leak is when you go out and do something to advance your own interest or to defeat a policy you don't like that happens to be the president's policy. That's leaking. Spinning is something entirely different. And it really is. And you know, some people, when I was White House Chief of Staff for 4 years, I went around, before I took that job, I talked to every former president who was living and every former White House Chief of Staff and talked to them about the job. And they said, you got to spend a lot of time with the press spinning the administration's line and getting it out there. We didn't do any leaking on each other in the national security team. We did a lot of spinning. And it was right.
It certainly worked. Well, on the subject of President Bush's historic role in bringing an end to the Cold War, do you have a favorite memory about the relationship between President Bush and General Secretary Gorbachev, and how through that relationship he was able to move the needle toward bringing an end to the Soviet Union?
Well, one of the big things, it wasn't so much the bringing an end to the Soviet Union. President Bush understood, and we and on his team, from about May of '89, after coming in January, that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, his foreign minister, were people we could do business with. They were reformers. They wanted to change. They embraced perestroika and glasnost, openness, and so forth, and they wanted to reform socialism, communism, but it got away from them. The freedom genie got out of the bottle, and there wasn't anything they could do about it. And that ultimately led to the implosion of the Soviet Union. But these two men, I think, will be well remembered by history because they're the first two Soviet leaders, or the first Soviet leaders who did not use force to keep the empire together. I never will forget a cabinet meeting in May of 1990. Not a cabinet meeting, a meeting in the cabinet room. We're talking about the unification of Germany. President Bush was at his absolute very best on that issue of unifying Germany. We were faced with opposition not just from the Soviets, who didn't want to see history repeat itself, but from the British and the French. They all opposed it. So it was the United States, George Bush and Helmut Kohl of West Germany, who got that done in a very narrow window of opportunity. And had President Bush not been as forceful and effective as he was, that would really never have happened. That was a signal, a diplomatic achievement, as was the coalition that he put together to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. You know, people forget that this president had one term. Many, many things happened of real consequence, but he was president with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate the entire time. He never once had a Republican House or a Republican Senate. And when we started talking about liberating Kuwait, we were beat up pretty severely, you know. I had to go up and do the testifying, and I've still got the bruises to show for it. These Democratic senators said, Mr. Secretary, how many lives is it worth to do what you want to do? Give us a casualty estimates and blah. What social programs are you going to cut to go to war in the Middle East and all that? And I finally went back to the president. I said, Heffy, I said, we got a problem. And we need to figure out what we're going to do about it. And because it's going to be, I don't think we can get the Congress to vote for going into Kuwait, liberating Kuwait. So he and I, and Brent, and some others, seized upon the idea of trying to get a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force against Iraq, a UN member state. That had never happened before, except in the Korean War when the Soviets walked out, and there was a UN resolution authorizing the Korean War. But we went there, and there was a big pushback against it by some in our administration, but also by Margaret Thatcher and others, saying, don't go to the UN, you'll get all wrapped around the axle and you won't get it done. And we said, no, we're going to try it. We're not going to bring it to a vote unless we know we have the votes. We did, and we got that authority from the United Nations Security Council to kick Iraq out of Kuwait, to use force. So we could go up on the Hill and say to a senator, Senator, you're not going to support the President of the United States on this, but the President of Ethiopia is going to support it. and it was really quite effective. But we also, in order to blunt the barbs coming from Senator Bob Byrd and others about how much this was going to cost us in our social programs, we decided we needed to go out and talk to the people who we were going to help and get some financial assistance. So we went to war. I tell people this was a textbook example of the way to go to war. You tell the world what you're going to do. You get the world behind you. You then get the American people behind you by getting the Congress to support it. You go out and do exactly what you said you're going to do. Bring the troops home, and then get other countries to pay for it. And we got other countries to pay for that war. I mean, we spent $10 billion. We suffered some casualties. Some Americans paid the ultimate price, 378 or something like that. But we got other people to pay for that war.
Well, I've heard President George W. Bush and other presidents talk about the toughest decision that a president ever has to make is the decision to send troops into war knowing there's a good chance that some of them will not come back.
Yeah.
So what's your take on what that difficult decision, hardest decision was for President Bush and how he processed the agony that went with it?
Well, it was a very, very difficult decision for him. He agonized over it. He was quite anxious. We had given Iraq an ultimatum that you get out and you get out unconditionally. We're not going to give you anything that you can point to and say you got something. You got to get out. This is unprovoked aggression of the most egregious sort. And you got to get out by January 15th. And if you don't, the ball's up. The ball game's over or something like that. Anyway, we said, this is it. And I got a call from President Bush on the afternoon of January the 14th. And he said, I sure would like it if you are free, if you could come over and have lunch and talk to me about this. And I did, and he was clearly having difficulty with that decision, thinking that there were going to be some young Americans who lost their lives as a result of his decision. Same thing I know that President 43 had to go through in the war in Iraq. It's very difficult, and 41 really agonized over that. He said one thing he said to me I'll never forget. He said, you know, Bake, he said, I don't think these casualty estimates I've gotten from the Defense Department could be all that far off. And we'd gotten casualty estimates that could go up into the 1,500, 2,000 range. It ended up being 378.
Well, obviously, once that decision was made and we went full speed ahead, the war was over in a matter of days.
Well, the air war softened things up. We bombed them for about, I guess, 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And the ground war was over in 100 hours.
In 100 hours.
Yeah.
Were you surprised that it?
Yeah, I think we were somewhat surprised that it happened as quickly as it did. There was never any support whatsoever on the part of 41 or his team for going to Baghdad and trying to convert that UN resolution, kick Iraq out unconditionally by force, into a regime change objective. We never had it.
Well, of course, at the time, there was a lot of criticism about the decision not to go to Baghdad.
Yeah.
But now, a few decades down the road, I think most people recognize it was the right decision. And so somebody of your age and stature, I'm sure it's one of the nice things is to let history take care of the ultimate judgment about those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, because we got beat up pretty good for a couple of years there about why didn't you guys finish the job you started out with? Well, we finished the job that the UN gave us authority to do, and that we told the Congress and the American people we're going to do. We did that job and no more.
You've talked about his amazing ability to build a bipartisan support and the fact that he had Democratic-controlled House and Senate throughout his presidency. And I know you were Secretary of State, but what's your favorite story of when he reached across the aisle to a Democratic senator or a congressman to try to get him to see things his way?
Well, I'm not sure I can pinpoint just one, but the authorization for this war was tough to come by. I happen to think it maybe cost Sam Nunn the opportunity to run for president. He opposed it. Others opposed it. We only won in the Senate 52 to 48. And those 52 were, each and every one of them were personally lobbied by President Bush. It was not easy.
I think when history looks back, among his many gifts, he had the great gift of building relationships.
Wonderful gift. Well, he wrote notes to everybody in the world. he was friends with everybody in the world. He was, we talk about the decision not to go to Baghdad. Prudence is something that he was known for. I understand we're going to get a view of that here when Dana Carvey might come on, but I love the way Dana used to imitate him. Said, "No, not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent." But he was prudent.
Well, like at least some great men, President Bush did have the capacity to be able to forgive his longtime foes.
Yeah, he did.
And a good example of that down and up relationship that you've observed over the years was between President Bush and Bill Clinton. Yeah. So what's your remembrance of how that transpired, of how President
Well, let me give you my remembrance in talking about forgiving, not a longtime foe, but a longtime friend, me. He was about to give a State of the Union, and I happened to have the Soviet foreign minister in my office. And the Soviets had been agitating for us to give Saddam something to get him to go out, that we were going to do something with respect to the Middle East peace process or something. We kept resisting that. But this guy, Besmertnik, went down after having a meeting with me the evening of the State of the Union. And he made a statement in the lobby of the State Department. I didn't go with him because it wasn't something we'd agreed to, that the press interpreted to mean that we were going to give the Soviets and therefore the Iraqis, who were a Soviet client state, something of benefit. And it just, the headlines were full of that. Not much about the State of the Union that was coming up. And so it took the focus off, and it was terrible. And he forgave me. And that's what I mean when I say that I was the luckiest guy in the world to be Secretary of State for someone who would protect me and support me and defend me even when I was wrong. I was luckier than that to be a 60-year friend of this beautiful human being. And you know, I see 43 and Laura here, and I think about all the achievements that 41 made in his life. And I think the one that he was most proud of was his family. He used to say, you know, they all come home. And it wasn't easy, was it? But he was so proud of that family, and he should have been so proud of it. And I know he and Barbara both were. But his relationship with Clinton became one of almost friendship.
I think Clinton. I think Clinton thinks that it really was friendship.
Well, I thought I think it's 43 who said he was a brother by another mother. It's a very good line. Yeah. Well, and he had that capacity. He was. You talk about broad gauge. I've never known anybody who was more broad gauge than 41. Look with Teddy Kennedy. You know, Teddy Kennedy gave one of the worst diatribes at the 1980 Democratic Convention I've ever heard against 41, against then candidate 41.
Yeah, vice president.
Vice presidential candidate 41, and 41 gave him a medal. I'd like to think I could be that forgiving, but I'm not sure I could be.
Well, I think he showed the way because Kennedy later presented the Profiles in Courage Award at the Kennedy Library to President Bush 41 for the way he responded. So I think he set an example there.
Yeah.
Now, I want to close by asking about the last times you got to spend with your best friend when you knew that he was passing away. And so what stands out about those precious moments that you had in the last few days or on the last day?
Well, in the last couple of years of his life, he'd been in and out of the hospital a fair amount. 43 likes to tell the story about my smuggling martinis in for him, which I did. But with your mother's approval. She was in the room. She was there in the room. On the day my best friend died, I don't know what, I woke up early and I thought, well, I just think I was going to go out and grab a Starbucks coffee, and I thought, I think I'm going to run by and see how Heffy's doing. He had not been out for a week, hadn't gone outside the house for at least a week, maybe a little more. And he hadn't been awake, frankly, for a couple of days. I didn't know that when I went over there. I found that out after I arrived. And his aide, who took such wonderful care of him at the end of his life, Evan Sisley, said, Mr. President, Secretary Baker's here. And he sat up in bed. He'd been sleeping for 2 days, I think they said. He sat up in bed, and those blue eyes looked at me. He said, hey, Bake, where are we going? And it was almost like we were going to go on a campaign trip. It was really, and I said, Heffy, we're going to heaven. And he said, that's where I want to go. And by that evening, he went there. But what happened was Susan and I were going out to dinner. We went on out, and about 8 o'clock that night, they called us. We were on our way back home, and they called and said, you know, you might want to come by here because he's taken a turn for the worst. And we went there, and he had. And I got to tell you, I've seen a number of people die. I've been with a number of people when they die. I've never seen a more peaceful passing, no struggling, he was, our rector was there. We said some prayers. Ronan, Tynan was there, the Irish tenor, and he sang a couple of songs for 41, and it was very peaceful, and some of his kids were there. Doctor was there, a few others, but it wasn't. It was a very peaceful passing, and you know, when Barbara died, he wasn't ready to go. He said so. He said, I'm not ready. As W said to me in the green room, he wanted to go to Maine. That's right. That's right. He did want to go to Maine, and he got to Maine, and then he got back here. But it was a sad situation, sort of bittersweet. But we should all hope that we could have such a peaceful passing. But what a mark he left on this country, and I know a lot of the people in this room, this hall tonight. But boy, did he leave one on me. I've never had a better friend, and it's pretty neat to be able to say that you have had a best friend for 60 years. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
That was awesome. Love you. Thank you.
Go, keep going.
Bob doesn't just do jokes about the president. He teases we've already done this, all the occupants of the White House. Wives, kids, even pets. And when our dog Millie came out with her book, Bob started referring to me as Barbara Bush, Millie's typist. And as soon as the book became a bestseller, Bob wrote her into the act, too. He said, Millie made over $1 million last year. It's a hell of a lot more than the president made.
Come on, these guys are busy.
It's the same thing I just read.
They wanted to do it over again, and you hammed it up. Okay.
Too much laughter.
Okay, here we go. No, it's fine.
Okay. Bob doesn't.
This isn't.
This isn't funny at all. I know it. Stop it.
All right.
Now, shh.
Okay, wait a minute.
That's funny.
All right, come on.
Bob doesn't just do jokes. Cut it out. We're going to have to ask you to leave.
Am I not in the picture, am I?
Well, you can hear you. I mean, there's no.
All right, here we go. I'll try to.
Okay. Bob doesn't just do jokes about the president. He teases all the occupants of the White House. Wives, kids, even pets. When our dog Millie came out with her book, Bob started referring to me as Barbara Bush, Millie's typist.
God, in this. Go on, he's not getting me in there.
Well, but just...
I hope.
That's it. Okay. And it's... What is this? Come on.
Oh, no. That's good. Okay.
About the Republican Party. Been consulting with some, thank you. I'm in enemy territory here. Been consulting with some Republican pollsters. Looks good, it looks good. Sat down with Newt Gingrich and Phil Gramm and we worked up a little ditty. G, want to lay down that funky thing you do back there? Republicans are teachers, Democrats are students. Don't vote for Donkey, it wouldn't be prudent. Gingrich and Dole, digging Bill a hole. You heard me and I meant it. We're taking the House and Senate. We're not gonna lose, not gonna do it. Not guy, not guy, not guy, not guy, not gonna do it, and a not guy. I say, not guy. What? I was doing my not guy.
President Bush is still on the hookup, and he wants to say something.
He's here now?
Yeah, should I put him through?
All right, put him in.
Hey, George Bush here. I'm watching you do your impression of me, and I gotta say, it's nothing like me. Bears no resemblance. It's bad. It's bad.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. President. I think it's a fair impression.
Don't see it.
You know?
It's totally exaggerated. Not me, those crazy hand gestures. The pointing thing, I don't do them. And also, nah, ga, da, never said it. In all my years of government service, I never once said nah, ga, da.
Anything else?
Yes, that church lady thing. What was that all about? Never got the point.
Well, isn't that special?
Well, whatever. Gotta go. Bye.
Everybody, I'm sorry I couldn't be there tonight to honor the extraordinary President Bush 41. My story begins in 1988 when I was asked by Saturday Night Live to learn how to do then Vice President George Bush. And I couldn't do it at all. I couldn't find a hook or a handle. It was horrible for like a year. And then eventually I got the idea that maybe I could combine, as John Meacham said, John Wayne and Mr. Rogers. So there was a John Wayne to the president. It was a little bit like, well, let's go over the ridge, Pappy, right? And then Mr. Rogers, kind of lyrical. Beautiful day in the neighborhood. Bring him back to John Wayne. You got George Herbert Walker Bush. And the rest is history. So I make fun of him on Saturday Night Live for 4 years. And then he invites me to stay and perform in the White House. I mean, I was completely shocked. So my wife and I stayed in the Lincoln bedroom for 2 nights. An incredible privilege. And this is not a joke. Back home, all anyone wanted to know was whether we made love in the Lincoln bedroom. And that's pathetic. And I'm not going to say here and now, but my son's middle name is Abe. My point to you, anyway, during our stay, the president asked me if I would do my impression of him in front of all these people at a cocktail party. And I was really nervous, but I did it, and he laughed really hard, thank God. And I love making him laugh. One of the things I used to do that he loved was my Ross Perot impression. So every time I saw him, I made a point of doing that. This is what made him laugh really hard. Now, can I finish one time? Can I finish one time? Let me tell you, in regards to the American economy, let me put it to you this way. You can't put a porcupine in the barn, light it on fire, and expect to make licorice. So eventually, we did a lot of charity events together. We do dueling bushes. I'd be out there going, wouldn't be prudent at this juncture. He'd go, nah, God, do it. And the crowd would just go crazy. So that was really, really fun. I was very lucky to enjoy a 25-year relationship with George and Barbara Bush. To know them is to love them. My wife and I happily received Christmas cards every year. In 1998, I had a health scare. I got a note from the president. Anything I can do, Dana? You know, we got great doctors right down here in Houston. Just very sweet of him. And then on Election Day, 2004, out of the blue, I get a phone call and I hear a familiar voice. Hi, Dane. George Bush here. How you doing? And I was so taken aback. I go, Mr. President, isn't your son running for re-election today? He goes, yeah. But how you doing? I'm like, fine. How's the election going? Don't know. Bar and I saw SNL reruns last night. Saw you out there doing your thing. Wondered how you were. And that was so him. That was just who he was. Always looking around the room, always making sure everybody was okay. So I'm honored to have had a chance to speak tonight, and I hope you have a great event. Thank you.
Dana Carvey is performing in Las Vegas tonight, otherwise he would be here, and that was so nice of him to record that a couple weeks ago. The story that he told about that party at the White House was actually on December 7th, 1992, during President Bush's lame duck period. It was a staff holiday party. It was 1 month after the election, and he was always thinking of others, making sure that he brought Dana in to make fun of him so that his staff could share a great laugh together and to cheer everybody up, and that was just incredible. The Dana Carvey character in Saturday Night Live was also very inspirational to what we're doing here at the Bush Center. And if you don't get enough of the people that come through here live, we've launched a new podcast called The Strategist, and they inspired by the skit on Saturday Night Live, but also emblematic that great leaders are ones who are able to laugh. And we're honored to have President Bush 43, who is emblematic of that comment as well. And so if you want to listen to people who come through the Bush Center, make sure you download the Strategist podcast. And when it comes to President Bush 41, there's no greater treasure trove of stories than, in addition to Secretary Baker, which was a real treasure, the former aides to President Bush. And we have three tonight, one from before his presidency, one during, and one after. David Bates became President Bush's personal aide in July of '78 during his first campaign for the presidency and served until January of 1981. And he joins us tonight from his home in San Antonio. Tim McBride was President Bush's aide from 1985 to 1990. Today he's a senior vice president at United Technologies in Washington, D.C. And Tom Frechette, who is a long run as President Bush's aide from 2000 to 2007. A period which included a number of disaster relief initiatives from around the world. And today he's a managing director at Avenue Capital. And moderating tonight is our own Lindsay Knutson, who's the director of leadership programming here at the Bush Institute. And she is uniquely qualified because she served as personal aide to Mrs. Laura Bush in the White House from 2003 to 2009. Please welcome our wonderful panel to the stage.
I'll go around here. What's that? Yeah, gotta go around. Okay, you get, yeah.
Well, this is gonna be fun. Well, we all know that the Bushes have a great sense of humor, so I think we should start right there, following that hilarious, those few videos. Tim, do you have any memories of President Bush's sense of humor?
Humor was a critical part of the presidency under Mr. Bush, and Secretary Baker referred to the closeness of the national security team. Well, at some point, President Bush created the Scowcroft Award to honor those people who fell asleep in meetings with the president. And General Scowcroft himself was the national security advisor to President Bush. He was burning the candle at both ends and had the knack of falling asleep himself. So that's where the name came from. But they would judge, and Secretary Gates was also part of the ranking committee for this, they would judge Scowcroft Award winners by how long they slept, the quality of the sleep, did they snore, extra points for snoring, and then the recovery. You know, did you knock over something as you woke up? Could you rejoin the conversation? So it became quite an honor to receive the Scowcroft Award.
Wow. You said ranking committee, and I think you have a story about a ranking committee.
I do. So I should introduce the sort of my introductory piece into George H.W. Bush humor. I had just come on board as his aide. I was probably there for 2 or 3 weeks, and I got a call down. Tommy, come down to my office. I need to talk to you, schedule, or writing someone, or an ambassador, this or that. And so I'm very nervous. I have my notepad, and as I sit there, the president, unbeknownst to me, the president had just received an electronic version of a whoopee cushion. And it was taped to the bottom of my chair. And so here I am, and a button gets pushed, and a sound, and that was strange, just the two of us in the room here. And then it happens again, and now my face is completely red. I'm glued to the paper, like, just let this end. There must be a, grand finale on the thing, because it went off, and 2 Secret Service agents and some staff members who were in on the joke came in, and that was my introduction to this is going to be a fun ride. So it worked out pretty well. But the ranking committee, and the family would talk about it more because it had gone on forever, and I think, when they ever had competitions or heats for, horseshoe or other games, the people would complain, why does 41 sort of have the fast pass through to the easy bracket? And he said, well, the ranking, don't worry about that. The ranking committee decided. And he eventually transformed that into judging of jokes. And so he would get a lot of emails that would come in, and he would rank them out. Good try. That was a 5. I want to see better next time. And I'm not sure I ever got above a 6. And I thought I had some really good ones there. But so that was the ranking committee. Oh, and he unveiled the rank. People complained. We want to know what this ranking committee is. And we tried to find a photo. We couldn't. But President Bush was tired of people asking, who makes up this ranking committee? So he had 5 people pose, and then they superimposed his head on top of all of their bodies. And that was the ranking commission sort of official. So there it was.
David, was the ranking committee around in 1978?
The ranking committee was around back then. Yes, it was. Ken had mentioned that I was involved in that first presidential campaign in 1980, and Secretary Baker was our campaign manager, and he ran a tight ship, and a very tight ship financially. And so a lot of 1979, we flew commercial, and we flew in coach almost all the time. And I remember we would be getting on the plane, and he'd say, "Don't linger here, Bates, or in the first class. We're in steerage." He referred to it as steerage. And I also remember we would see on the campaign trail, particularly as it got later in 79, we would sometimes cross paths with other presidential candidates, and we would often see a Falcon jet parked at an airport, and it was John Connolly's. His campaign had rented it, and of course we were flying either coach commercial, or if we were flying out of small airports, we might have a twin-engine propeller plane. But anyway, as we would be driving by near Connolly, the jet with Governor Connolly, he'd act like he was picking up a car phone, and he'd say, "Charlie, fire up the Falcon for us. We're on our way." So anyway, he would just so many comments like that I remember so well.
Well, just to finish on the humor piece, it was always funny to see President Bush. He would give these speeches, what he referred to as white-collar crime, but he would go and give these speeches, and they would involve a reception line, and then they would have the speech, and then a dinner after. And what always amazed me is people would always come up and say, "I never knew he was so funny." And I think it showed how much respect he had for the office, that his public persona was one in which he, it was always in regards to I have to do the right thing for the office. But when you got to know him, his sense of humor was a key component to who he was, and he was just one of the funniest people out there.
Before we go any further, does anyone even know what a personal aide is? I feel like we need to address that first. Well, as Ken said, I had the great pleasure of serving as Mrs. Bush's personal aide in the White House during both terms from 2003 to 2009. And body man, body woman, we were very fortunate to serve such great principals and serve next to top-notch White House staff, including our great chiefs of staff. Anita McBride, Tim's wife, was Mrs. Bush's chief of staff in the second term. But we were chiefs of stuff. Stuff. That's what personal aides do. They accompany the principal and juggle and manage stuff. And I was fortunate to do that and witness firsthand Mrs. Bush's brilliance, her compassion, and her sense of humor in 73 countries, all 50 states, rallies, rope lines, hospitals, war zones, carrying a 40-pound bag of stuff. In this bag, I had Barney and Beasley cards we'd hand out to children. We had Sharpies, Altoids, Purell. We had stationery, briefing books. 1978, what was in your bag, David?
Well, that was pre-internet and pre-cell phone days, right. So it was a very different time. And of course, I always had to, whenever we landed somewhere, I'd have to run and get on a phone, check in with the office, make sure there are any changes to the schedule. I remember at the end of each day in a hotel room, I'd just empty my pockets of business cards and notes and have to try to make sense of it before the next morning. But there were other aspects that are very similar to what all of you all did, and trying to keep the candidate on time, remind him who he needs to acknowledge, help him with thank yous after the fact, which is very important for him always. Usually with him, I mean, he loved people, and so usually your difficulty was trying to get him out of an event or out of a meeting. But there were occasions when he was ready to go, and he just felt like he'd done enough, or somebody was been in his ear too much, or something. Anyway. But he was ready to go, and if I didn't pick up on it, we had a little signal, and he would say, how are we doing on time, David? And I would say, sir, we really need to get going. And so that's what. But that's all a part of being personal aide. All those types of things. So yeah.
Well, we have a summer lad with us, a former summer lad.
Yes.
So what is a summer lad, and how does that transition to personal aid?
So I grew up in Maine, where the Bushes go to Kennebunkport for the summer. And President and Mrs. Bush used to they'd always hire some young high school guys to come out and help with everything. I mean, it was one day you were helping with errands, or you were, Mrs. Bush needed some finishing over here in her garden, or, you need to go pick someone up at the airport. But it was someone who was, future Vice President Dick Cheney, or it was Condi Rice, or something. It was all these, or Terry Hatcher, or some famous person you were going to, pick up at the airport. So, you're a 16-year-old kid, and you're like, this is the greatest thing in the world. I mean, it really was. And when I got to college, they had Maine's a small office, so they had one intern. And I had the opportunity to be an intern in the office, which really meant you talk to every crazy person that calls the office, and then you send out mail. And then luckily I hadn't made a big enough mistake where they asked me to come back to be aide full time. But the aide jobs are sort of, it's really, there's a lot of similarities throughout the years. I mean, obviously Tim was the aide during the presidency, so it's a little different being in the bubble. But I always joke that there were really two responsibilities. One was making sure you had a Sharpie in your pocket, and the other was carrying the ridiculous bag of trinkets, which I don't know why we didn't give them out at the end of every trip, but they were always there in case you needed them. And I will say, I was just glad that the President Bush 43, the way he referred to us today was probably the nicest version of how they've usually referred to personal aid. So thank you, sir, for upgrading us a little bit there.
Tim, you were the aide in the office of the vice president and the office of the president. So tell us about the contrast and some memories from that and your role.
Yeah, the level of support and attention changed almost overnight after the president was elected, after the vice president became president-elect. When we traveled as vice president, it was often without a secretary. Someone had to type the speech cards on a card using a select trick. If he made changes, he'd cross it out and write in what he wanted to say, not like it is today. We had to order room service for him to eat and make arrangements for his exercise. So there wasn't that much support. When he became president, overnight that changed. The attention as president-elect doubled or tripled, really. The national media was on him. Election night in Houston was a big celebration. The next day, the president-elect flew to Washington, and we had been told there were going to be 5,000 people or so at the hangar, and we didn't think much of it, and just a welcome. What was a really big to-do, both from the media standpoint and from the public, and it said to me overnight that everything has changed as a result of his being elected president. And even though I'd been his aide 3.5 years, by then I realized it's going to be very different, and indeed it was.
And on that role, when you were his aide in the vice president's office, you told a story that when we spoke earlier last week about one of your special duties and gift finding.
Oh, yeah. So I hadn't been the vice president's aide for more than a couple of weeks, and I wasn't even sure what I was doing exactly. And he says, as he's heading over to the West Wing, hey, tell the agents we're going to go Christmas shopping after this. I thought, wow, what is a vice president? He said he was going to buy a present for President Reagan. I thought, well, this is going to be really something. Where do we go for that? So we leave the White House, and the motorcade pulls up in front of Al's Magic Shop on Vermont Street, about 3 blocks away. Well, okay, that's not what I was expecting. And he looked around for the perfect gift for President Reagan, whom he did adore, and came out with the magic 8-ball for making decisions. And that was the Christmas gift. I thought, okay, this is going to be, I'm going to learn a lot in this job.
David, obviously, President Bush was such a remarkable person. Why don't you share one of your favorite memories from your time with him?
Boy, one memory is so hard to think of just one, but what I remember is just how grateful he was to people that supported him and helped at his events. And I mean, he always wanted to make sure am I thanking everybody I need to thank at this event? Are we making sure all the thank you notes are going out for this event? And he'd do a lot of handwritten notes, as Secretary Baker said, and then then obviously he couldn't do all that he wanted to do, but he wanted to make sure that the office was getting the rest out. And we, at events, he would always say, I want to stop by in the kitchen and thank the folks in the kitchen who helped make this event possible. He was just always very appreciative of everybody that supported him and was helping him.
Tom, you have some time, obviously lots of memories in Maine, but on that note, on character, what do you have to share about?
So we had talked about, there was one of my favorite stories, there's a lot, but one was President Bush loved his Secret Service detail, loved them. And, I almost thought of him as an extension of his family, where he'd always ask, how's your family, how's your wife, how's your kids? And, would stay in D.C. so that, when he was president, so that they could not have to be far away from their families. But one of my favorite stories is one of the agent's son was diagnosed with leukemia at 2 years old. And he had to have treatment, and so naturally this young man, Patrick, his father, the Secret Service agent, had shaved his head in solidarity with his son. So when he came back to work, the detail saw it, and immediately the entire detail shaved their head. And the next day, guys were working around. President Bush said, well, what's happening here? And they'd explained it to him. And within minutes, he said, get him in here. I want to have him in here. And, he wasn't doing it for show or for any other reason, but he did it because he wanted, the little boy, this is a guy who himself lost a child of leukemia at a really young age. And so for him to do this, to just show support for this 2-year-old boy, and then the father and the detail was just amazing. Of course, they invited this poor mother came up, and it was, she was just bawling, when she basically saw that photo, and she arrived and got out, and they probably should have told her, because it's just sort of waterworks. But it was a sense of true character of who George H.W. Bush was. It's just he truly did things for others. He cared, and that was one of my favorite.
So sweet. As I mentioned, we managed a lot of stuff in our roles, and that included a lot of travel, and we all have different travel experiences as personal aide. And Tim, you have a lot of stories that you tell. You told a really sweet story that happened in Budapest.
So
Speaking of character.
in early 1989, the Iron Curtain was beginning to fall. Secretary Baker referenced that. And so President Bush decided to make a trip to Budapest to show his support for the reforms that were beginning to take place there. So we traveled to Budapest. It had been a rainy day. We arrived at the site, and there were tens of thousands of people in essentially their main park there. And for some reason, no doubt a mistake on my part, we didn't have his raincoat. And so the President said, that's all right, we'll figure something out. And one of the agents offered up his collapsible totes raincoat. And so the President said, perfect, I'll wear that one. So out he goes, gives his speech, and then after the speech, shakes hands with folks along the rope line. And he sees this sweet little lady who was a little cold because it had been rainy and chilly, and he said, oh, poor thing, here, take my coat. And I said, well, sir, you can't give that coat. It's not yours. So we start struggling over this coat. and finally, he says, I'm giving her the coat. And he gives her the coat. And so now I have to find the agent and tell him, yeah, he gave your coat away. Eventually, then the president wrote a check to the agent. We sent him a picture in the check and the coat. But it was a very sweet thing, notwithstanding it wasn't his coat. It's great.
On the subject of character and coats, you have another story.
This one is, to me, says everything about President Bush, and I seem to have an intersection with he and I in coats. But on the day that he was inaugurated president, we were leaving the White House, the traditional coffee with President and Mrs. Reagan. And it was a fairly balmy day, 50 degrees or so, and the president-elect says to me, I'm not going to wear my coat. I don't need my coat for the ceremony, which was a sign, leave it in the car. We get to the Capitol. We're just a few minutes away from he and Mrs. Bush being escorted out onto the platform, and he sees that Nancy Reagan is bundling up President Reagan against the cold, which wasn't that cold. And he turns to me and says, I need your coat. I said, well, we don't have your coat. It's 4 stories away. And the real problem was there was no way to get the coat and be back in time before the ceremony would begin. And he said, but I can't look hardier than President Reagan going out there. I don't want to draw this contrast. And so I offered him my coat very quickly and said, here, wear this one. It fit. He wore it out just to show that he was in a coat, took it off, and then was sworn in without a coat. But he was very concerned on this day that presumably is one of the most important in his entire life. His concern was for President Reagan and how some small gesture, walking out with or without a coat, might draw a negative contrast to the president. And it amazed me and said amazing things to me about his ability to think and to look out for others and to put himself in some other place.
Tom, building on kind of a couple of things Secretary Baker said in the first panel, I like to call you sometimes the ambassador of disaster. You were kind of there with the tsunami and kind of wrangling those efforts, and tell us about that and the efforts that went along with that.
Yeah, I thought we should talk about President Clinton and President Bush relationship, but Secretary Baker really downplayed that. So, we'll give a shot. I do want to say one thing before I get into it, which is sort of funny, because which is so shocking, because Tim just talked about a couple of mistakes he made. And the big joke when I was the aide was that Barbara Bush would say, you're never going to be as good as Mr. Perfect. And this was Mr. Perfect right here. And whenever we'd go on a trip, it was getting so bad, I made a few blunders. And, Barbara Bush was very nice to say, Tim wouldn't have done that, or Tim would have done it this way. And one of Mrs. Bush's friends traveling with her eventually said, we should get a bracelet made that says, what would Tim do? And you could wear that. And on top of that, Marvin Bush, who was Marvin Bush, one of President Bush's son, near the beginning of my tenure, said, there's a group of aides together, and he's like, guys, I don't know what you're talking about, but don't worry about who the best aide is, because it's David Bates. So you guys just try your hardest. So I was already handicapped before I got there. But sorry, talking about the relationships, President Bush and President Clinton, they had just a very formal relationship. They had met in 2004 for the opening of President Clinton's library, where the president was there and all the other former presidents. But the horrible tsunami, the day after Christmas, I believe, or around Christmas in 2004, the president had asked both these former presidents to come together to help raise awareness and funds. They both agreed very quickly. And it was basically bringing these guys together, the power of bringing these two guys together. One who bitterly beat the other one in an election, the fact that they could go out into the world, travel together, for common good, sent quite a signal. They visited all the countries that were devastated, and many of the leaders said, what you two are doing, we could never do in our own country. So it had a real impact. It was so successful that sadly they did it again. The president asked them again for Katrina and Rita. And through it all, they really sparked a friendship. They were essentially traveling around on Air Force 2, one bedroom, two presidents. And so when they would get on board the very first time, President Clinton, to great credit, with much deference to 41, said, no, you take the bedroom. But President Bush 41 had prepared a roll-out mattress that he brought up and set up for President Clinton. But it was an interesting trip. But it sparked a friendship. It was real. And from that year, that was 2005, President Clinton, essentially came to Kennebunkport, Maine every summer just to visit. And there was nothing on the agenda. It wasn't, how's this, or what are we going to do here? I'm going to do this. It was, how's your family? How are you? Let's go for a boat ride, though President Clinton didn't like that very much. But it was truly a great relationship, and it was something that carried through all the way to the end of President Bush's life. And in 2005, that same year, there was a big event, the Pope's funeral. His Holiness John Paul II had passed away. The president had asked for a U.S. delegation, included the president and the First Lady, and it also included President Bush and President Clinton. And so one of our funny stories was the two presidents were now getting along. That's good. But they landed in Rome very late at night. And if you've never been in a presidential motorcade, it's like 50 cars. I mean, it's just massive, and it just goes on. And they were all riding in the same limo. They go and pay their last respects in Vatican City. And there were so many details and so many delegations there that they only let the secure package or 5 cars in. So technically, President Bush 41 and President Clinton's motorcades were outside of the Vatican walls. So they go to say goodbye to the president. He's staying at the ambassador's residence in Rome. I think he says to his dad, "You're all set with the ride?" "Yes, of course," in the Secret Service. And they take off. And all of a sudden, standing there is President Bush, President Clinton, 2 aides, myself, one of them, and then 2 Secret Service agents, 1 for each. And so this is just to remind you, a time of some harsh rhetoric from the United States to certain nations in the world. And I think our second, so the president decided, well, let's just walk to the gate. And I think our second delegation we get to is Iran. And all these security, 10 security guys come running out, wanting to get a photo, but it was just the way they were. They just, this is no problem. We're just regular people. We'll just walk out to our motorcade. So it truly was an amazing friendship.
One of the great things I get to do here as Director of Leadership is work on our Presidential Leadership Scholars Program, which is the leadership program that we work with mid-career professionals in partnership with 3 other presidential centers, the Clinton Center, LBJ, and of course Bush 41. And we're actually going to be there on March 7th. And this module, we're focusing on what Secretary Baker so eloquently said for us earlier about these strategic partnerships, these relationships that President Bush formed and how he was able to get things done in his administration. And Tim, you were there for so much of this time during the White House. Do you have any memories of these
You'll recall
great
Secretary
partnerships?
Baker referenced the difficulty during the time of German reunification and getting the British and the French on board. But that success was really set in motion at the beginning of the president's presidency. The first visitor that the President and Mrs. Bush invited to Kennebunkport was French President Mitterrand. And many on the staff said, why would you invite this guy? He's a real stiff, he's not your type at all. But what President Bush understood was that in his presidency, he's going to need the French as allies, and he understood the importance of the personal diplomacy, the building the relationships, and it did pay off, importantly, on German reunification. It went a long way to building trust between the 2 leaders, and it paid off on German reunification, and then again at the time of the Gulf War. And that was something we saw regularly from him, this ability to make connections that would have great meaning in the future. He understood that in a way that many on the staff did not, including the U.S. response to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
In relationships, David, you saw different relationships forged because you were with him in the very beginning when he was Ambassador Bush, Mr. Bush, before he was president in 1978. What was that like to be on the campaign trail with Mr. Bush?
Well, it was a very interesting time. He had a political action committee then. It was called the Fund for Limited Government, and it had 2 employees when I started. One was Karl Rove, who was the executive director, and he needed to spend more time in the office, and so that's, fortunately, a job opened up for me, and I was in the right place in the right time, having gotten out of law school. Our other employee was Margaret Tutwiler, later became ambassador to Morocco and spokesperson at the State Department. But I was the 3rd person hired, and Secretary Baker said he was an asterisk when we started. I mean, it was a big field. You had Ronald Reagan, who nearly won the nomination in '76. You had Howard Baker, who was Minority Leader of the Senate. Bob Dole was the VP nominee in '76. John Connally, former governor, Texas Secretary of Treasury, 2 respected Illinois congressmen. So nobody really gave us a shot, but he was the last man standing. Won some big primaries: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Iowa caucus, and we went to the convention in 1980, and it will be the last convention where I'm sure, and it was the last time where the nominee went to the convention without having picked a VP nominee, and really hadn't settled in his own mind whom he was going to pick. And we thought that President Bush was probably a logical choice because where he had shown strength in the country, he had foreign policy expertise. President Reagan had the domestic expertise, but I remember the Wednesday of the convention, and President Bush was scheduled to speak that night because he had done so well as a candidate. But I remember about 5 o'clock that night getting ready to go over the auditorium and watching Walter Cronkite, and that's the first we heard of the Gerald Ford thing, and it looked like Ford was going to be the nominee. And by the time that we got over to the convention hall, I remember he was getting ready to go up to speak, and Jim Wooten of ABC News was there. And President Bush said to him, "What's the latest on Reagan and Ford?" And he said, "It's a done deal. Their agents are coming over to the auditorium, and they're going to both make a joint appearance tonight and announce it." He kind of shrugged his shoulders and went up the stairs to the podium, and he gave typical of him, he gave a short, sweet, speech, not a thing about himself, all about how great Ronald Reagan was and how he needed to be elected president and what a great president he would be. And then we walked back to the hotel, and I remember him saying, let's go get some beer, let's just have a little gathering, a little party, and we all figured that was the end of the road. And I remember Jeb and I were staying in the same room, and when the party broke up, we went next door to our room, getting ready for bed. And I don't know, after about 15 minutes, Mrs. Bush knocked on the door and said, "Jeb, your dad wants, come on, your dad's got some news for you, and David, you can come in too." And Jim Baker was in there, and we walked in, and President Bush said, "Ronald Reagan just called me and asked me to be VP nominee." And it was an incredible story. But I remember the next morning, President and Mrs. Bush going over to have breakfast with President and Mrs. Reagan, and they really didn't know him, and they didn't know him at all, and they had heard rumors that they really didn't want him to be on the ticket. So I think it was as nervous as I'd seen both of them. You all know the look. He was grinding those molars pretty good. And they were both quite nervous. But I remember they walked up, they went to the suite, and Ronald Reagan opened the door, and he had this big smile on his face and both arms out, and I could tell immediately that he had put them at ease, and they had a nice breakfast, the four of them, nobody else, and I'll just I know I'm going long here, but on the way down they had a press conference after the breakfast on Thursday morning, and they were going down in the service elevator, and I was fortunate enough to be on it, but I remember somehow a conversation came up about their dress, and I don't know, President Bush said something like, "Well, maybe I wish I'd have been dressed like this or that." And anyway, Reagan said, "Well, that reminds me of this joke," and he told a very funny joke. And of course, they both love jokes, and it broke up President Bush. And to this day, I kind of think that President Reagan may have been an old Hollywood trick to kind of loosen up, and knowing that President Bush would want to make a good first impression as the VP nominee. That he had a little method to that joke to kind of loosen him up, and he did great. They both did great in the press conference, and from that point on, it was just a great relationship all the way through the presidency.
You're about 5 minutes over on that one, but we'll.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So, Tom, I want you to sleep. I want you to sleep better tonight. Tim wasn't perfect.
Not at all.
Oh, man.
Tim did you leave something behind once?
Clothes in Fort Knox. the president, he was president then. We flew to Fort Knox. The president was having a briefing with the troops and then was going to jog with them. And then we were flying by Marine One to Louisville for an event that night. Well, about halfway to Louisville, I realized I had left his suitcase at Fort Knox, which wasn't going to help him for later because he was still in his jogging clothes and we were off to some other event. So I asked the agents, "Where's that car? Is it on its way?" "Sure, it'll be here soon." Well, about 20 minutes before we're to leave to the event, the president said, "Hey, Tim, I need my clothes." I said, "Yeah, that's a problem. We don't have your clothes." So the agents donated some clothes and shoes. He got all dressed. About that time, his clothes arrived. He put his own on, but he probably should have fired me that night, but didn't. But he was good-spirited about it.
I don't know anything about that.
Leaving clothes?
Ooh. Okay, moving on. Tom, let's talk about parachutes. Where did this business, sir, we're almost done. Parachutes. Where did this business come in with parachuting for the birthday, and tell us about that.
Yeah, so President Bush parachuted out in World War II, and obviously a very emotional time. He lost 2 crew members when it happened, and I just think it stuck with him, and he always just sort of wanted to do it again right. And he did. And I think oh good, they're showing. So he did a few jumps. And so then after a couple of these, he decided, I'm going to do one on the 80th birthday. We're going to do raise some money around it, and it would just be great. We'll give it to some charities, and it was wonderful. But he was now 2 or 3 in post-presidency of jumping out of an airplane. So as they were preparing, press and people were asking why, they were asking particularly Mrs. Bush, why is he doing this? She said, this is for a good cause, and I know it's good, but either way, this is his last jump. And so, President Bush said, you could probably phrase that a little the and he ended up doing another 10 years of jumps. But the real meaning there he is. That's the flying Elvis suit. Yeah. The other one was the Golden Knights, black suit. And someone had come up to him and said, "Gosh, you look very handsome in this." And so we couldn't get him out of it for a few hours after the jump, because he said, "Look at me, I'm the new Fonzie." His thumbs up. But he always did, so it was fantastic. But the real meaning was, that old guys can still do something, and you have to set goals in life. And so, be a few years ahead, and I don't want to be one of those guys that's just sitting around drooling, playing shuffleboard. Although, right before he did do it, we said, if this doesn't work out, you can try a new hobby. And it was the staff got him a shuffleboard kit. But anyway, he loved it, and he was great. He did it all the way to his 90th birthday. Quite impressive.
Well, to close this panel, I wanted to close on something that Secretary Baker said so sweetly. What a mark that President Bush left on this country. What a mark he left on each of you, I'm sure. I am speaking personally in my role as personal aide, just shaped so much my personal life, my professional life forever. And I know in that capacity, that's what happens. So let's start with you, Tim.
Yeah, what I learned without realizing at the time that I was learning it was the leadership quality of really putting yourself in the shoes of others. President Bush had this ability to empathize. He certainly had a life of service, but he also was a leader who cared about the contributions of everyone in the organization. It's something I've tried to take in my own business career.
David?
Yes, I learned so much from him, but I guess to summarize the 4 things that do your duty, nothing less, maintain high ethical standards, the highest ethical standards, treat everyone with kindness and respect, and always put your country first. And I just remember being in the White House when he was president, in another capacity, but just hearing it on decisions he had to make, he would always just say, well, we're going to do the right thing let's do the right thing for the country. We'll sort out the politics later, but let's do what's best for the country. And let me just say here that I believe his son, whose library we're honored to be in tonight, made every decision with that same frame of reference.
So I would just say he just always cared about the other guy. And I know we've said a lot of, virtues and principles that he lived by. He was gracious, he was generous, he was patient, he listened. He always exuded class, always. And, it was everything you learned as a child or that loved ones told you growing up, or at different points in your life. My wife actually is here, and she has no problem telling me when I'm running a little low on some of those categories. But he lived by these every day. And we are on the stage, and so many others are beyond lucky because he altered the paths of our lives for the better. First, by firsthand knowledge of watching someone live by a code of ethics, by principles, and to see it. And then through friendships created in his orbit. And so it was impossible to spend time with George Bush and not leave wanting to be a better person, a better version of yourself. He just had that effect on you. So, there was no secret why we all loved him. He was our leader, he was our hero, and, simply put, he was the kindest, most caring gentleman that I've ever known. And if the world could be a little more like George H.W. Bush, what a better place it would be. Yeah.
close out with our CEO.
I want to thank Secretary Baker, Talmage, and this wonderful panel. Please join me. What a special, special conversation. Thanks also again to Highland Capital, and if you haven't done so already, please put on your calendar March 5th for our next program, an insider's look at Camp David, which launches our special exhibit that opens that same week in the museum, away from the White House, a look at presidential retreats. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you at the next event.